Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of April of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Korovka direction. The Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish almost complete control over the southern and the southeastern part of the stronghold. Today, if you remember, in the previous video we have already discussed this episode. The Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were bombing the Russian forces and the Russian positions in the southern part of Korovka. And when talking just about this particular video, we can't see the Russian soldiers or Russian forces on the ground in this video. The only thing we could do is to trust the source and to trust the author of this video when he was saying that those were the Russian positions under very heavy Ukrainian fire. Of course, most of the developers, based on that map, updated their maps, but we decided to wait a little bit, and a few hours later the Ukrainian sources, basically the same source, published the original video, a very long video of Russian attack on the direction on the southern part of Korovka. For example, on this video we can see a significant number of Russian armored vehicles moving towards the stronghold. Let's say at least on this episode we can see two waves of attack. One wave was moving along the river, another way was moving through the fields. We see almost no resistance from the armored forces of Ukraine, just a small mortar strikes, maybe some mines on the ground, so nothing special, nothing that could stop the Russians during that attack. We see that the Russians, without any problems, were entering the stronghold, the southern part. Then the Russians were moving along the railways, and basically without any resistance and without any barriers from the Ukrainian side, the Russians landed their infantry in the farms that located in the western part of the southern Korovka. The Russians captured positions, established a foothold, and started the clearing operation and started digging in deeper. After that we can see another wave of armored vehicles entering the stronghold. So just during that attack, during that episode, the Russians sent obviously 2, 3, 4 or 5 waves of attacks. Those weren't like attacks, those were mainly the redeployment of forces, additional reinforcements to the southern part. If you remember, a few days ago we were talking about another Russian attack when they managed to cross the railways and to enter even the southeastern part, and during those attacks the Russians were trying to establish a foothold to repel Ukrainian attacks and to dig in deeper. Today we saw not the attacks, today we saw the concentration of Russian forces. You know that once again, if we increase the numbers of this since let's say yesterday, on the 15th of April, we received significant number of videos of how the Russians were bombing the central part of Korovka. So first of all, the Russians were trying to destroy the Ukrainian artillery positions, mortar positions. The Russians were trying to discover and hunt Ukrainian, let's say, FPV operators positions. The Russians were suppressing Ukrainian anti-tank positions. So that was artillery preparation, the things that we saw yesterday. And today, the video that we saw just before all these videos of Russian attacks wasn't attack. That was an attempt to concentrate significant number of forces, a critical mass in the southern part, with the purpose to start offensive further to the central part. So, and obviously during the next 48 hours we're going to receive more videos exactly from the central part of how the Russians were trying to storm this area. Obviously the Russians are planning to establish control over this territory, so to cross the railways first of all, and to get the first building, to get inside of the first buildings of the residential area of, not residential, of industrial area of the Krasnogorovsky Vogneoporny plant. So this is the Russian main plant. This is high-rise building area. There are a lot of fortifications and strongholds, and if the Russians somehow are able to do this, to, let's say, to complete the clearing of the southern part, to enter the industrial zone, and to, let's say, establish control over the residential area in the southeastern part, this will allow the Russians to establish complete control, fire control, let's say, aviation control, FPV drone control over the Ukrainian positions that located in the eastern part of Krasnogorovka. We are talking about this high-rise area, and as soon as the Russians establish control over this territory, the Ukrainians will have just one thing to do left, is to evacuate their forces from Krasnogorovka as close as possible to the main supply roads that's located in the northwestern part of the stronghold. So basically the Ukrainians during the next probably 72 hours, maybe during the next week, will try to get as close as possible to concentrate their forces forces, let's say, in the opposite part of Krasnogorovka to Russian positions. And this is smart because we see the Russians are pushing. The Russians are about to, let's say, collapse the Ukrainian defense belt, to break through the Ukrainian defense belt. And for the Ukrainians, it's much more better to stick as close as possible to this area, because at any time they can receive an order to fall back. And now you know that there is currently is very, let's say, popular among the Ukrainian soldiers to fall back and to leave and to abandon their positions, as we saw an example of 67th Mechanized Brigade. So now Ukrainian army, every single soldier of Ukrainian army understand that he can do the same. He can, let's say, abandon positions without any consequences for him. And if there are going to be any consequences, he can always, let's say, tell his commanders about the case of 67th Brigade. So that's why they're going to do something like this. Now we are moving further to Pervomaysk area, where we got also significant number of updates and details, as we discussed in the previous updates. According to some sources, the Russians managed to enter first of all, and then to establish control over the first buildings in Nitailova. We have this report from different sources, from different mappers. So if we summarize everything by the, let's say, 8 p.m. of the local time of the, let's say, 16th of April, the Russians managed to establish control over the first buildings in Nitailova. From the other side, we see that the Russians continue bombing and attacking the stronghold, another stronghold, Ukraine of, let's say, town, with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to redeploy reinforcements in reserves and to start counterattacks on Russian positions. But the reports about Nitailova were not the most important updates during the previous 24 hours. Today, the Russian military expert Rybar also published his own analysis about the situation. Probably he has some insights, and today he reported that after the Russians established complete control over Pervomaysk, the Russians break through the Ukrainian defense belt to the south of Pervomaysk and managed to encircle up to a few hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers inside of this artillery pocket. So if we summarize the Rybar report, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to establish control over something like this. And as you can see, according to this, let's say, configuration of map, we see that the Russians were moving along Central Street towards Nivoyska, the town, the village by the name of Nivoyska. And very likely the Russians will continue doing the same. Maybe during the next 24 hours, the Russians will start another movement, let's say, towards the forces in Pervomaysk from Nivoyska itself, and then the Russians will create a real cauldron. Currently, we can't tell for sure how many forces, how many soldiers the Ukrainians still have in this stronghold, in this, let's say, artillery pocket. If we take a look at the configuration of this area, we're going to see at least 4 strongholds in the area. This is the biggest stronghold one, the second, the third, and this is probably the 4th stronghold on the direction. And there are not like thousands of Ukrainians, but probably 200 or 300 of Ukrainians we can find on this area. And basically, the Ukrainians who are located in these fields have already lost their possibilities to abandon their positions, let's say, through this small corridor towards, let's say, the Karlovka and Karlovka water reservoir, because currently, according to Rybar, the distance between, let's say, the edge Russian positions in Pervomaysk to the south to Nivoyska is less than 1.773 less than 2 kilometers. So the Russians can attack the Ukrainians from the south and from the north. So very small chances for the Ukrainians to evacuate and to save their lives on this direction. Anyway, if it's true, if this information confirms, then if this information confirms, probably we're going to start receiving updates this upcoming night about the encirclement of another batch of Ukrainian soldiers on the direction. Also, during the day, the Ukrainians tried to counterattack the Russians. They were trying to, let's say, to suppress them, probably to maintain the corridor and to give the better, let's say, situation, better positions, better, let's say, conditions for the Ukrainians inside of the artillery pocket for evacuation. But the Russians discovered mostly every single artillery forces on the direction and destroyed as a result of counter-artillery fire. So for now, no chances for the Ukrainians to evacuate and to escape the artillery pocket. Also, a few more things about this direction. You know that currently, when talking about the previous 2 weeks, we were talking a lot about two brigades, 25th Brigade, and we remember that this brigade was operating on Yasnobrodovka, Umanska, Nitайлova directions, and the Russians, according to information we have, managed to let's say defeat this brigade on the field and to capture a significant number of prisoners of war. Also, we had reports that they also abandoned their positions. Also, during the previous few days, we were talking about the 67th Brigade in Chisev Yar, the neo-Nazi brigade that abandoned their positions and that allowed the Russians to encircle the Ukrainians in the eastern part of Chisev Yar. And today we start talking about another defeated Ukrainian brigade that currently operates on the northern Avdiivka direction. And currently we are talking about another loser, we can say it like this, the forces of 115th Mechanized Brigade. According to information we have, if you remember, according to information we have, the Russians during the previous few days managed to establish control over significant, let's say, square kilometers of the territory to the southeast of Cheretsina and to the east of Novobakhmutovka. Today, the Russians, the pro-Russian sources, pro-Ukrainian sources, and pro-neutral sources updated their maps, showing that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish significant control over the territory along the railways, let's say, in the direction of Cheretsina. So this approximately the Russian control significant foothold. Now the Russians can attack in any direction. They can attack Keramik, Novokalinova from the west. The Russians can continue moving further to Cheretsina itself. The Russians can attack Novobakhmutovka, so they have lots of options what to do next. And the reason of such a significant progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation is that the forces of 115th Mechanized Brigade also left their positions, abandoned their positions, and basically allowed the Russians to attack other Ukrainian, let's say, forces on the direction into their flanks and basically to collapse them and to defeat them. So this is another brigade that probably will be reorganized or something like this by the Ukrainian armed forces. So once again, as we discussed, we have more geolocations, more confirmation of additional Russian progress on Novobakhmutovka direction. Furthermore, due to the fact that the Russians managed to establish control over this territory without almost no resistance and barriers from the Ukrainian side, so that's why the Russians are not so exhausted on this direction as the Russians were exhausted on Berdychi direction, which is still under control of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. The Russians decided to continue their offensive operation further to Novobakhmutovka, and today we start receiving the first scenes, the first videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the forces and Ukrainian positions to the west of Novobakhmutovka in the village by the name of Solovyova, where the Ukrainians keep some operational reserves, some ammo depots, some warehouses, and now we see that the Russians have a very, let's say, tight focus on the area, trying not to allow the Ukrainians to send additional reinforcements to Novobakhmutovka because the Russians currently are storming the village. So we see that the situation is getting worse and worse. We see that Ukrainians can't stabilize the situation. They couldn't stabilize, and we see they don't have any idea how to do this in the future. The Russians from their side continue bombing and attacking Cheretsina, preparing the town for offensive operation. And if we make a conclusion, we can say that the situation is getting faster and faster. If when talking a month ago, the Russians were capturing 1-2 villages in 2-3 weeks. Now we see that the Russians are moving so fast, so probably during the next months, if the situation continues developing the same way, the Russians may start capturing few towns, villages just per day, because the Ukrainians will not find the solution how to stabilize the line of combat contact. And this will remind us probably the Second World War, basically the 44th and 45th, 1944, 1945. So the final end, the final part of the, let's say, Second World War, when there was no forces from the German side who could stop the Russians, the Soviet forces who were moving and capturing one town by another without almost any resistance. So we can see the same story in special military operation, and this may start very soon. Furthermore, the Russians were bombing Novostylovka Persha, so now we have lots of evidence, lots of videos confirming that, let's say on the 15th, 14th, 16th of April, the Russians officially started the assault operation on the next defense belt of armed forces forces of Ukraine on this direction. And I'll remind you that when talking about the second defense belt, we are talking about the area between Karlovka, Skuchne, Mezhova, then Novopokrovska, Solovyovo, Novobakhmutovka, and Cheretina. And 3 towns of this defense belt is already under very heavy Russian fire and pressure. Furthermore, we got reports from Novokalinovo. Also, Rybar, the Russian military expert, stated that the Russians managed to cross the Pershatravneva Street, this one, and to establish control over these intersection of the roads, let's say in the eastern part of Novokalinovo. Significant progress, if it's true. So the Russians are getting closer and closer to the water barrier, and if the Russians are able to get the water barrier, basically they will cut this area in 2 parts, the western one and the eastern one, and after that they will be able to start movements in both directions. So once again, the situation is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians in this area. Furthermore, we got this is yesterday's video. Now we are moving to Bakhmut Artyomovsk direction, where we also continue receiving significant number of updates and details. And probably the most interesting and the most valuable video we received during the previous 24 hours is this one. This video was published by the Ukrainian sources, and on this video we can see, according to the author of this video, we can see that the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian positions along Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. So of course, when talking just about this video, it's very difficult to even to believe whether it's true or not, because if we take a look at this video, we will not be able to see even a single soldier that can confirm that this is exactly the Russian positions. We can see just a small ammo depot that was under very heavy fire by some forces. The Ukrainians are saying that very likely the author of this post made a mistake, and basically on this video we can see how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions, because there are completely normal bridges. As you can see, there are 2 pontoon bridges in the same area, and the Ukrainians are saying that if those positions were under Russian control, obviously the Ukrainians during the retreat process would destroy the bridges and not to allow the bridges to come into the hands of Russian forces. So it's logical, of course, that if the Ukrainians left this area, obviously for them it would be much better to destroy the bridges. But from the other side, I'll remind you that during the previous few days we got a lot of talks about the forces of 67th Mechanized Brigade, and according to information we have, they abandoned some positions on Chasiv Yar direction, and most likely the Ukrainians of 67th Brigade abandoned exactly these positions and basically moved to the central Chasiv Yar. So from this perspective we can make a conclusion that it's not like 0 chances that these are Russian positions. It's like a small chances, but chances that the Russians did manage to reach the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal by some special forces, some VDV forces, some Marines, and something like very experienced. And of course, if it's true, if this video will be confirmed by different sources, by additional video, if we confirm that the Russians as a result of offensive operation managed to establish control over this territory, obviously this is the end of the eastern Chasiv Yar, because from this perspective the Ukrainians have no chances to evacuate from the eastern part or to the central and the western part of the stronghold. Yes, the Ukrainians probably in this configuration still have control over this part of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. Probably there are a few bridges in the area that they can use for evacuation, but obviously this is not a very good idea to use the bridges, because everything that Ukrainians will try to redeploy from one side of canal to another will be destroyed obviously by the armed force of Russian Federation. Furthermore, I'll remind you that according to information we have, during the previous 20 days the Russians managed to improve their positions on the southern flank of Chasiv Yar as well. Currently we haven't received any geolocations confirming this, but it's also could be possible. Of course, could be possible. Furthermore, we got more updates from the eastern Chasiv Yar itself. According to information we have, the Russians managed to establish control over this part. Few buildings were captured by the Russians, according to the Russian sources, of course, and some pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed this information as well. But when talking about geolocations, geolocations are telling us completely different story. Maybe the Russians do have some positions in the forest right in front of Chasiv Yar, but exactly the area that, according to some Russians, were captured by the Russians is under complete Russian fire control with FABs and, let's say, artillery artillery and so on. So for now I believe that there are no Russians inside of eastern part of Chasiv Yar. Maybe there are Russians somewhere in the residential area, in the forest. Maybe the Russians control just the first buildings on the, let's say, eastern outskirts, eastern edge of the town, but not so deep, and no control over high-rise building. Furthermore, we got another video of how the Russian FPV drone was bombing and attacking the Ukrainian soldiers exactly along the buildings that were, according to some Russians, captured by the Russians a few days ago. So very likely that there are still no control, no Russian forces and positions inside of the area. We have another video of how the Ukrainians managed to bring some additional reinforcements to the eastern Chasiv Yar. As we can see, they were unpacking or trying to unpack the vehicle with ammo, with goods, probably some munition or something like this. The Russians discovered the Ukrainians and start bombing them with FPV drones. So the situation is very critical, obviously. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombing the western and the central part of Chasiv Yar with multiple launch rocket systems. Significant damage the Russians managed to deal, trying to slow down the Ukrainians, trying to destroy the reserves and reinforcements. The sources reported that Ukrainians of 61st Brigade were, let's say, were replaced, or the Ukrainians tried to replace them by forces of 41st Mechanized Brigade, and the sources are saying that when, let's say, urgently Ukrainians redeployed few trucks with 41st Brigade, the Russians managed to discover them and to destroy them as a result of missile, probably Iskander or Tornado S strike. So the reinforcement arrived and basically was destroyed immediately at the same moment. So as we can see, the battle continues. Obviously, the Russians, I think, have no chances to establish control over entire Chasiv Yar before, let's say, the victory day, but very likely the Russians will capture the eastern Chasiv Yar before that date. So this is the situation on this direction. Now we're moving further to Siversk area. We have small updates, just, let's say, small activity of the Russian artillery. The Russians were bombing the Ukrainian forces along the tree lines, just regular artillery duels, nothing special. The same story in Bilogorovka. The only difference is that the Russians started FPV droning the northwestern and the western, let's say part of landfill before. The Russians were bombing the southern and the eastern part of the landfill, and now the Russians moved their focus further to the west. Maybe it means something, but for now we can't make like a certain, let's say, conclusions on that. The Russians continue bombing the towns in the vicinity of Liman with FABs, with missiles, with Iskanders, and we continue receiving information about Russian activity to the west of Kovalyovka. During the previous few days we were already talking about the area. We had some missile strikes, some Iskander strikes, we had some videos of FAB strikes, and now we see another video of another FAB arrived in the area. So the Russians started some activity on this direction, so probably we might see some intensifying of actions from the Russian side during the next few days. If we increase the numbers of days, so we're gonna understand what I'm trying to tell you. So we see some certain Russian focus to the west of Raigorodka, Kopanki, Stepovo, Novoyegorovka, Raigorodka. So we see some activity. Maybe the Russians are conducting some reconnaissance and combat or in force, and probably maybe soon we're going to see a real combat on the ground. Furthermore, the Russians published another video how they managed to discover another air defense system along Oskol River, and as a result of Lancet strike, that air defense system was also destroyed. So we see that situation is getting not very good for the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are very angry, and they're not angry about the critical and very bad situation on the ground. The most thing that makes the Ukrainians very angry is that, according to Zelensky, he blames that the West, that Article 5 of the alliance was not needed to protect Israel, which is not a NATO member. So Zelensky trying to tell us that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but nobody protects Ukraine as Western countries protect Israel. So that's why he's very angry, and he's not just angry on the Western countries, he's angry on the situation that people in Ukraine, population in Ukraine also see this situation, because when the Western countries didn't send help to Ukraine months ago, everything could be explained by difficult situation in United States production, difficult situation with the prices, difficult situation with other things that, say, Western countries doesn't have their own air defense defense or missiles, that everything's so bad, they can't protect even themselves. But now Zelensky and the Ukrainian authorities can't explain people why, when everything is so bad in Western countries, and so that's why they're not helping Ukraine, why they in one day helped Israeli not just with weapon, but they also were involved in defense operation. Basically the F-16s of NATO countries were bringing down the Iran missiles during the Iran massive missile attack. And so this is the most important, that people don't understand the situation. So of course this will lead to some consequences to Ukraine, to, let's say, the entire morale, to entire spirit, and so on. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.